Last class, we saw how living organisms are categorized based on how they gather food. So, moving on, today we shall see the feeding relationship of organisms of an ecosystem. How do they interact by eating each other? Let's look at this diagram. The grass is eaten by the rat, and the rat is eaten by a snake, and a snake can be eaten by a monkey, and the monkey can finally be eaten by a leopard. So this is the series of interactions between these animals according to how they eat each other. The plants are eaten by the rats are eaten by the snakes are eaten by the monkeys are eaten by the leopards. Now let's have a look at this diagram. There is a grass, and the grass is eaten by a grasshopper, and the grasshopper is being eaten by beetles or honeybees or wasps, and the wasps are eaten by frog. The frog is eaten by a snake, and the snake is eaten by a hawk. In the second one, you can see there are some phytoplanktons, small plant-like structure in marine ecosystem, and these are eaten by small krills. These krills are eaten by crabs by later on larger fishes, and at the end a shark will be eating those fishes. So based on how the organisms in an ecosystem eat each other, they are categorized into two groups: producers and consumers, as you can see in this diagram. So producers are the lowest level in the food chain that we have discussed before. So they are able to make their own food through either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. And producers therefore are typically plants, and they can also be known as autotrophs. Let's have a look at these eating pattern in an ecosystem. Grass eaten by grasshopper, and grasshopper is eaten by frog, and frog is eaten by snake. And again there are about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 such type of interactions are given in this diagram. I want you to pause the video and look at this diagram and identify which are the producers in each of these interactions, and comment below. Next one is consumers. So what are consumers? Consumers are organisms that get their energy from eating other organisms. They can get their energy from either plants or other animals. So they can also be known as heterotrophs. So difference between a producer and a consumer. So producers are organisms that make their own food using sunlight. So they can be known as autotrophs. And what about consumers? So consumers are organisms that eat producers or other consumers. So they are heterotrophs. But this classification is based on how the organisms interact with each other. Let's look at this interaction. So the plant is eaten by the grasshopper is eaten by the bird, and the bird is eaten by the snake, and the snake is ultimately eaten by the owl. So you can see plant is the producer and rest are the consumers. But in this consumers also there are different types of consumers. So the first one is the primary consumer. So the primary consumers are heterotrophs that feed on producers. Since producers are typically plants, primary consumers are herbivores. The later one is known as a secondary consumer. So secondary consumers feed on primary consumers. So examples of primary consumers include grasshoppers, rabbits, rats, etc. Look at this interaction. The primary producer is wheat, and the primary producer is being eaten by the primary consumer, that is the mole rat, and the primary consumer is eaten by a hawk, and here the hawk acts as a secondary consumer. Now let us look into another interaction. So the producer is eaten by the primary consumer, then the secondary consumer, then tertiary consumer. As you can see, the consumers are divided into primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. And there is an extra differentiation. There is a quaternary consumer just above the tertiary consumer. Often this happens in the nature. So the primary consumer feeds on the producer, while the secondary consumer feeds on the primary consumer, and the tertiary consumer feeds on the secondary consumer, and the quaternary consumer feeds on the tertiary consumer, and it goes on. So this is a typical interaction of animals in an ecosystem based on how they eat each other. Apart from producers and consumers, this kind of interactions also involve a third kind of group, and they are known as decomposers. So, in conclusion, the interaction in an ecosystem based on how the organisms eat each other are of three types: producers, consumers, and decomposers. And the third one, decomposers, feed on the remains of other animals. Decomposers play an important role in the ecosystem. By digesting dead matter, they put nutrients back into the soil, making them available to the producers. So, carefully observe this diagram. This is an aquatic ecosystem. I want you students to observe this diagram and categorize these animals into different groups based on how they eat each other, and comment below.